Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'm going to be finishing off one of my toe up polarity socks with a pretty Picot bind off. I like using the Picot bind off for sock cuffs because it adds flair by creating this pretty decorative edge, and literally because the fabric edge will flare out and get a little bit wider, just like my leg gets wider as you move up further away from the ankle. Because this bind off causes the cuff to flare, there's a couple of things you should remember. First, this bind off is going to look better when you are actually wearing your hand knit sock. Otherwise, it makes this cuff edge look a little bit droopy in its unworn state. Second, because the Pico bind off naturally flares out, in most cases, you're going to want to do the bind off with knitting needles that are one or two sizes smaller than what you use to knit the rest of your project to keep things looking as neat as possible. Let's get started. Before we begin, if you enjoy our videos, consider joining the pack and becoming a member of thechilidog.com for ad-free access to our entire learning library, priority support, and more. For this pattern, I want to create the smallest picots possible and space the picot points 2 stitches apart. So ultimately, I'm making cast on 1, bind off 3 picots. This combination pairs really well with 1x1 or knit 1, purl 1 ribbing like I have here for the cuff of my socks. If you're into the math part, the number of stitches you cast on determines the height of the picot. I want petite picots, so I'm only casting on a single stitch. The spacing determines how many stitches you need to bind off. I want my picots to be 2 stitches apart, so I'll need to bind off those 2 stitches, plus the extra one I cast on for a total of 3. To begin, I've already switched to knitting needles that are 2 sizes smaller than what I used to knit the rest of my sock. I need to do a setup by casting on 2 stitches with a plain knit cast on, which just means I'm going to insert my needle knitwise, cast on a stitch, and slip it from the right needle to the left. Insert my needle knitwise, cast on a stitch, and then slip it from the right to the left. You can see I'm kind of keeping things separated here with my fingertip because these stitches tend to want to leap over each other. Now I need to bind off 3 stitches with a plain knit bind off, which just means I'm going to knit those first 2 stitches. Knit 1, knit 2, and then bind off a stitch by passing 1 stitch up and over the top of another. Knit, bind off number 2 by passing a stitch up and over. Knit, bind off number 3 by passing a stitch up and over. And then I can slip that final stitch from the right to the left. And I've created my first pretty little picot. From this point, I'll work the rest of the way around my sock by casting on 1 and then binding off 3. So I cast on 1 by inserting knitwise, cast on, and slip from right to left, and then bind off 3. By knitting the first 2, bind off 1, knit, bind off 2, knit, and bind off number 3, and then slip that stitch from the right to the left. And I have my second pretty picot. And I'll continue around my sock. When I get to my final stitches, I'll repeat the sequence one last time. Cast on 1, and then bind off 3, one, 2, 3. Then you can cut or break your yarn tail so that it's long enough that you can weave it in later. I'm going to pull that yarn tail through my final stitch. That fastens things off. I no longer need my knitting needle. So I fasten it off. And then you can see there's a little gap or jog right there in between the last picot and the first one. So to close up that little jog, thread your yarn tail onto a needle. And then you can pull the yarn tail down through the first stitch of the first picot. So just thread it through, pull it down to the wrong side, and that closes up that little gap that was right there. And then you can weave in your yarn tail on the wrong side of your stitches. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do a pretty picot bind off. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more knitting tips and tutorials. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechilidog.com and look for the toe-up version of our polarity socks. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!